I'm excited to be here with Cara Harbstreet here at the ReFED conference. And your session today is on this intersection of diet, wellness, and food waste. How is food waste reduction connected to wellness and diet?
Well, I'm so glad to be invited to participate in this event and have this conversation because as a dietitian, in my mind, that intersection is always front and center. When I think of food waste, the number one thing that comes to mind is wasted nutrition.
Okay.
And when I survey the landscape of what consumers are eating, how they're eating, where they're eating, food waste is a part of that conversation in each of those settings. At the household level, we also talk a lot about diet quality. And when we consider the foods that are most often wasted, either at, food service or household settings, it does tend to be some of those very nutritionally dense and delicious foods that you and I and everyone else should be eating more of.
So when I'm an everyday consumer and I'm thinking about how I treat myself better with food, I'm oftentimes not. I'm just kind of looking at things like protein maxing or like taking my vitamins. I'm not thinking about sustainability. Is that a narrative or is that something that we can change over time where people will think about, hey, not only do I have to think about how I take care of my body, I need to think about how I take care of the food system and the earth better.
Absolutely. You touched on something that I think is more and more at the front of our mindsets and how we approach food. And that is that crossover between personal health on the individual level and then planetary health at the collective or societal level. And one example that immediately comes to mind of how we're thinking about this on a day-to-day basis is this trend towards plant-based eating.
Yeah.
I think the narrative for quite some time now has been that you as an individual person have the power to really drive change and feel like you're contributing to some of the solutions through your dietary choices. And when we take that parallel idea and overlay it into the food waste conversation, I see many of the same messages pulling through very strongly. These are ideas like the way that you order food at a restaurant or how you might plan your meals for the week ahead. Repurposing leftovers, right? Like really bringing some excitement back to the kitchen for some of these day-to-day things that have historically gone overlooked in the food waste space.
It's so interesting. In the food tech world, the alternative protein, the plant-based food eating trend has had a tough couple of years. We've seen the struggles of Impossible and Beyond, but there's no doubt there's a connection between eating more plants is less harmful towards the earth as animal agriculture is. Animal agriculture is very harmful to the earth. And so how can we get back to, especially here in the U.S., get U.S. consumers who think about like protein maxing and like eating lots of meat? How can we get them focused on that? Is it through social media? Is it through mass media? Is it through education?
That's a great question. And I think it's a sticky conversation as well, because there are so many factors at play. I'm based in the Midwest, and that is cattle country. Animal agriculture has been a huge part of our food styles, our food ways for such a long time. And so for me, I think we do have to tread rather carefully because we don't want to inadvertently or unintentionally repel someone away from that message. So my approach, and one that I would recommend for anyone working in the food space, is to think about how can we add versus taking away. I am always an advocate of options and choice. And I think that's one of the biggest things that speaks to consumers and relays that message that, hey, we're on the same team here. We share these values, we share these goals, and there's no such thing as this perfect dietary eating pattern or this quote unquote right way to achieve some of these goals. So I think being mindful of that while also inviting that culinary perspective is what keeps people engaged. When that food tastes as delicious as whatever alternative they might have considered, and then we time it with the other conversations and trends that are happening in the moment, I think that's how we can really build momentum in this space and start to stack some of these topics on top of one another and really start to move in lockstep in the same direction.
TikTok, Instagram, these big platforms have people in those companies that are dedicated on food because it's such an important content category. And if you look at influencers, and a lot of the stuff I consume on TikTok and Instagram, it's food centric. I find what I'm going to cook next week or tomorrow on Instagram. And so, but the problem is there's a lot of, I think, misinformation about wellness and what you should be eating. So when you think about as a nutritionist and someone who thinks about this as a dietitian, how do we battle that? Because I don't think we're going to get away from people getting food recommendations or think about what they're going to eat from social media. How can we battle against all the misinformation floating around in that space?
Well, Michael, you really nailed it because the misinformation is so saturated at this point. We are facing an uphill battle, but the great news is that there's a very low barrier to entry for engaging on these platforms and starting to combat some of these confusing or contradictory messages. One huge advantage that food has is that it is incredibly photogenic. It has that mass appeal. People are seeking that novelty, that interest, and they build that enthusiasm behind their favorite content creators. As a dietitian, that's not a part of our formal training as far as engaging with the public in that sense. But the reality is that many people are spending lots of time every single day on these social media platforms. So it's a powerful opportunity for us to really reach them where they're at and take back some of that narrative to say, hey, you may have heard this, or here's what's circulating in the headlines, and show that not only are we aware of the other trends happening in the moment, but that we're paying attention to what they're interested in. If we're always leading with the facts or the data, that doesn't tell as compelling of a story as when we emotionally relate to them human to human. And that social aspect of social media, I think, is where the sweet spot is for really challenging some of that misinformation.
I think everyone should have a dietitian or nutritionist who could counsel them on what they can eat, but that's realistically not a reality. And so when I look at the world today, we can't ignore the rise of AI, artificial intelligence, and how it's starting to infiltrate every part of our lives. And one of the big trends of the past year has been agentic AI, essentially little agents that act essentially as doing a very specific job. And so I think one of the things we're starting to see is people saying, hey, could an agent become essentially your own personal nutritionist? So I'd love talking to someone who does this for a living. Is this a tool that you think people will use, that you might use? Do you think ultimately an AI agent could essentially for everyday kind of counseling, step in and kind of advise people on what to eat?
So Michael, I'll revisit what you said about framing it and using it as a tool, because that's exactly how I see it. The reality is, again, this technology is here to stay, and the better we are at understanding what its capabilities are, the better we can leverage that to actually be useful and practical for our everyday lives. As a dietitian, I'll be the first to say that I don't think we're at the point yet where an AI learning tool can replicate the type of interaction you would have with a clinician. Our skill set is really designed to understand where those tension points are. What are the barriers that's preventing you from reaching your goal? Or what other resources can we pull in as additional tools? And that's where I think using AI as perhaps a starting point is a great way to then understand what is my next step from here. That might be, requesting a referral from your physician or having a conversation with your healthcare team, because at the end of the day, that partnership and that relationship with another person, as opposed to a screen or a keyboard, can help you really build those habits that will stick for the long term and build towards sustainable behavior change that you're trying to achieve.
So you're not worried about your job being taken by artificial intelligence? At least not now.
Not.
Yeah. Okay.
At this point, I used to say that my hope would be that my role as a dietitian might someday become obsolete, because everyone is as resourced as they need to be and has the knowledge that they need to make those choices. But I think in revisiting the topic of social media and how saturated the misinformation is, I do feel rather secure that there will always be a role for those passionate nutrition experts in the healthcare.
I think so too. I just thought I'd throw it out there to you. Another big part of today's conversation in the zeitgeist is the rise of GLP-1 drugs, like Ozempic, and I talked to a lot of food companies, and it's been front of mind for them certainly. But what I've seen over the last year is, 2 years ago, it was all fear and like, oh my gosh, people are going to be buying less food. Now I think a lot of food brands see it as an opportunity, because the reality is you can't be taking Ozempic for a lot of people, especially on a weight loss journey versus diet. If they have diabetes, they're not going to be taking these their whole life, and they need an off ramp. So that becomes an opportunity for food brands. So you as a nutritionist, though, when you think about these new pharmaceutical interventions, what do you think? Where do you think this is going? Or is this an exciting time? Do you think this is something that overall is a net plus?
It's an interesting question because as far as my perspective and my understanding of the data we have so far is that in some regards, it's a little too soon to tell.
Okay.
We are still waiting for some additional data to really understand what that off-ramp looks like.
Yeah.
What does that transition phase look like? And also when it comes to those nutrition-related outcomes, how can we plan for and better predict what those outcomes might look like at the individual level? I'm still thinking top of mind nutrition. Always, always, always. Even if you're eating less or you are pursuing this personal journey, you really do have to consider what does that long-term health picture start to look like? Now, when it comes to the overall food landscape and what we're seeing from CPG brands and other innovations in the marketplace, I think there's a key opportunity here around satisfaction because the reality, once again, is that even though you may be eating less, you're still seeking some of those same enjoyable and pleasurable aspects from the food that you eat. So we're already seeing some interesting innovations around new flavors, different products that are tailored to meet that craving for satisfaction. And so it'll be really interesting to watch this space in the months and years ahead because it is moving quickly. And it's my personal prediction that we're only going to see more changes.
And it starts to change the conversation towards nutrient density, right? Because if you overall you're eating less calories, but you also need to get those nutrients. So if you're a CPG brand, you need to sort of think about how you can get the right nutrients into people, and then people on their own personal eating journey need to think about that as well.
Absolutely. And I think this is where we cross into the conversation around processed foods, because when I think about nutrient density, we're having conversations around things like enrichment and fortification. And what the conversation has transitioned into around processed foods is that those are elements that some folks are shying away from. And we really need to hold some space for the nuance around nutrition when it comes to those things, because as you mentioned and put so eloquently, that nutrient density is really a non-negotiable when it comes to some of these health outcomes.
I mentioned earlier about how Americans seem to be fixated on protein maxing. Everything I go to Costco and everything's about 20 grams of protein, 30 grams of protein, and we're just trying to pack it in. But I think kind of the forgotten stepchild of nutrition has been fiber. And we know that fiber, kind of a fiberish diet, is tied to so many better health outcomes over time. But it does seem like maybe we're starting to see a little bit more awareness around the fiber conversation in the general population. What do you see happening there? Can we get fiber on the discussion boards more, get it part of the conversation more?
Absolutely. I mean, Michael, you took the words out of my mouth. As soon as you mentioned protein, my mind flipped and it's like, hey, how can we invite fiber into the fold? And I think this is a really interesting way to learn from the mistakes of the past. You know, fiber has not been the same glamorous macronutrient as protein or even some of the heart healthy fats that we've had conversations around with omega-3s and whatnot. And so I think we really need to connect those dots in a tangible, realistic way of what are the benefits. I think for the fiber conversation specifically, a lot of what we hear are those negative side effects. So things like GI symptoms or discomfort, bloating, you know, these are uncomfortable experiences that for the average person, they might rather avoid than, you know, invite into their lifestyle. And so when it comes to that, I think we have a better story to tell around some of these fiber-rich foods that are very shelf-stable, very affordable, very simple to prepare, and then bring it back to taste. Really incorporating that into a meal setting rather than viewing fiber-rich foods as individual ingredients and seeing them as part of the bigger picture when it comes to what we're having in a meal or snack. All
right. We're here at ReFED. We're having a great conversation over these 2 days in Seattle about food waste reduction. What are you most excited about as a nutritionist, as a dietitian, about what you're hearing here at ReFED?
So far, I think the conversation at ReFED has been moving a mile a minute. This is my first time attending the summit, and I could not be more thrilled to be here. I think the number one most exciting thing I've seen is the policy conversation. In my world as a dietitian, this is a touch point that we often don't have. And so to see and witness these conversations and meet some of the change makers and the thought leaders that are driving that policy conversation forward, it's very validating and also very encouraging to see that even though this doesn't necessarily take place at a high volume in my sector of the food waste or sustainability space, there are dozens, hundreds, thousands of people and organizations who are solely focused on that aspect. And that is one of the things I hope to see more of, and am very thankful that at this point I can confidently say that that is the case.
All right, Cara Harbstreet here, 2025 ReFED. Thank you for spending time with me. It's been great.
Thank you.